Welcome to the Single Era Diaries, exploring the journey of a woman who hasn't experienced what it's like to be single in her entire adult life, and pretty much most of her teenage life too. Each episode will navigate the journey of finding a sense of identity, exploring the challenges of co-parenting, finding love of self and healing, all whilst tackling the complexities of the checkered landscape of dating and dating apps, meeting new people, and operating solo in a world that celebrates couples, marriage, and codependency. I am your host, founder of Nascent Media and newly single woman, Jade, and this is the diary of my single era. This week's episode is all about the motherhood penalty, which I think is a topic that inevitably hits so many women, regardless of whether they're single or not. But I do feel, perhaps from my own current ongoing lived experience, that when you are a solo parent or when you're in your single era, the motherhood penalty and the impact that it can have can be far more difficult to navigate and potentially much more impactful. Why am I talking about the motherhood penalty at this time of the Single Era Diaries? Well, I think it's important to remind those that listen to the show that as a woman who has, for the majority of my life, been incredibly independent and financially independent, I have, over the course of this period of my previous life unraveling and finding myself in this new juncture of adulthood, not in a long-term established relationship, that for the very first time I've made some really poor decisions around how I have managed my businesses and how I've managed myself. And inevitably, when something does come to an end that is so significant, like a long-term relationship or a marriage, that can really have an impact on our mental health. And I have in no way been not susceptible to that. I, of course, as have shared on the show, really fell foul of some really challenging times over the course of last summer and through the autumn, and even to some extent now I'm still dealing with the aftermath of my life as I knew it becoming undone. And so that can have an impact on those that are experiencing those changes. It can impact how we show up in our lives. It can show up with the habits that we form, but it can also impact the work that we do. And as somebody that has been self-employed since 2018, being a solo parent as opposed to a parent in relationship, irrespective of the fact that previously and for the majority of my life I've been the main earner in my household, there is definitely a shift when you find yourself being a solo parent and you don't still have that sort of handoff and pass back and sort of tag teaming that you have when you are in a family dynamic. And that's definitely one of the more challenging aspects of my old life ending and my new life beginning, where I don't have that consistency in support and handoff. And so as a result of that, and of course as a result of learning things about what were happening with my former partner and really just getting to grips with how it felt to be alone and hurt and managing and processing the emotions that came with that, I really didn't focus in the way that I should have done or would have done had I have had the capacity to really focus on maintaining my businesses and keeping them going in a way that was sufficient. What I did do, however, is I took a great deal of time out to work on creative projects, to heal, to exercise, to try and recalibrate my sense of self to this new identity that I find myself developing and leaning into now. The result of that, of course, means that financially I am not as abundant and liquid as I have been historically. I've moved things around, I have taken on some debt, I have really invested in the idea of the podcast that you're listening to, but also the other podcast that I'm creating with the production company Nascent, which is the business that I created at the back end of finishing my studies. And so that does mean that I've had to make some really tough decisions. And when it came to the back end of last year, so the end of 2023, I reached a point where I felt that attaining some degree of financial stability through employment would be a sensible thing to do. And the reason for that is anybody that's listening to this that is self-employed, or anybody that has been self-employed at any point of their working life, will know that there is a precarious nature to being a self-employed person. You don't have the consistency of continuous work. You have to win work, you have to hustle, you have to send pitches, you have to negotiate. And a lot of the things that can easily be taken for granted with employment, which is that you turn up, you do a job of work, you do it well, and you're paid consistently and timely, either weekly or monthly, that level of stability when you're self-employed falls away. Now, coincidentally, at the time that my relationship with my ex was starting to run into some problems, and I was also concluding an executive master's program, which is probably an episode for itself for another time, my mental health and my capacity to operate was significantly diminished. And so I unfortunately didn't deliver on the client contracts that I had to the level of performance that I have been previously. And so that meant that I unfortunately ceased those contracts, and it meant that I had some savings that I was able to utilize to get myself through. But that, coinciding with the unraveling of my previous relationship and becoming a solo parent and a co-parent and all of those good things, everything had kind of come to a head at the back end of 2023. So my plan was, I will go back into the workforce. I have lots of experience in my career that I believe is as useful now as it was before I stopped being an employed person. I've got a lot of skill and certifications and qualifications and a whole body of working experience that didn't stop when I became self-employed. They simply shifted to become something new and to be more adaptable to my circumstances, which at the time of starting my small businesses was to be a present mother who still needed to work and who still needed support her family. But my belief about walking back into the job market has been an incredibly rude awakening, and that really is the reason why I'm talking about the motherhood penalty today on this episode, because a lot of the issues that I had researched and written about in my master's program, which interestingly my dissertation was talking about and focusing on and researching why mid-career women are leaving the workforce to such a large extent when they have achieved such significant prominence in their careers. I didn't expect to encounter the level of challenge and issues that I have done since seeking to re-enter the job market. Now, there is the question on very many people's minds, and there are those that have shared it with me, which is, well, why are you going back into the job market when you have got this self-employed business? And I guess just to reiterate, the feeling of stability that you have when you're in your comfort zone, which can be a relationship, it can be a family dynamic, it can be whatever it is that you have become used to. Even if there are elements of that aren't really working for you, it's still your known comfort zone. And so my known comfort zone was being in relationship with my former partner for the best part of a decade and a half. And so there came a level of capability and a level of output that I came to rely on. And the reality is that when that fell away, and as I've shared, the management of my finances hasn't been as focused and attuned as it has been historically, it meant that I viewed going into employment as being something that would enable me to have some degree of security whilst I was continuing to pursue my creative projects. The challenge though, is that the world of work in some realms, and I can't speak for all, I can only speak in those that I've encountered over the course of the last few months, are still not prepared to support the needs of what it is to be a mother, or perhaps a father if you're somebody that wants to balance your children and your career. And I say that having done a variety of different things that I had previously done before I became a mum that worked very, very well. I did the whole reaching out to my network, contacting the very many senior decision makers that I've worked with over the years, reaching out to them, sharing with them my CV, sharing with them the work that I had done to attain my MBA, sharing the businesses that I had run successfully for the last few years. And I really believed that in doing that, by the beginning of this year, so walking into January 2024, I would have a contract and I would be employed or would have some kind of contract that was ideally part-time, enabling me to still work on this podcast amongst others that I'm currently developing, but that would also have a level of hybrid flexibility to them that would facilitate my being able to do the things that are really important to me as a mother, such as the school run, such as the activities that my daughter participates in, such as being home to prepare her dinner at the end of the day. And I have been really alarmed and concerned that the world of work, despite the fact that we have lived through and existed through a global pandemic where pretty much everybody worked at home and demonstrated that productivity isn't impacted, despite the fact that so very many organisations are talking about how they're being much more adaptable and they're adopting these styles of working and ways of working that support working parents, despite the efforts by our governmental leaders to sort of champion things that can really bring people back into the workforce. Despite all of that, I found the response that I've received from the traditional world of work to be incredibly disappointing. So much so that I wrote a piece about it entitled The Motherhood Penalty. And I published it on my Substack. And I felt that it would be really helpful to share the insights from that piece to anybody who is listening to this that is also in a position where the buck stops with them financially, where they're a solo parent, but the lifestyle that they and their child have is very much dependent on them. Or maybe it's not any of those things. Maybe you are simply like myself, you're a solo parent and you have got to work because we need to work to live, essentially. So let me jump into what it is that I wrote for Substack, talking about the motherhood penalty. And this is really an insight into the entire journey of becoming a mother, but also what it is to sort of experience the challenges that I have experienced over the last few months with trying to find some kind of contract or some type of employment, which I will add, there's very many employers out there that are prepared to take you on a merry dance. And I would really urge anyone that is listening to this podcast that has a level of influence or is connected to senior management or is part of an organisation that is not currently adopting a flexible hybrid working approach that is consistent. If you're in an organisation that has perhaps taken an opportunity to promote or advertise roles as being part-time or hybrid and then they actually aren't, then I would really I would invite you to share this podcast with them. And if not the podcast, then certainly the article that I wrote on Substack, and I also published it on LinkedIn as well, because I really feel that it's necessary for those that are in hiring positions or leading organisations or senior management or directors in organisations to really take stock of the impact that their outdated approach to hiring and retaining female talent that happen to be parents is incredibly damaging, and that taking people on a merry dance of potentially offering them a role and talking about things going really well and that there's a role that's being created and you're going to get an offer this week, all of that is so incredibly damaging. And having just experienced that over the course of the last few weeks, thank goodness I've got a fairly strong grasp of my mental health, because there are very many others out there who may not, and this sort of experience could possibly tip them over the edge. So feel free to share this episode with those people if you are connected, or indeed share the article, because I believe that it will hopefully capture their imagination and might give them some food for thought in terms of the way in which they manage their hiring practices going forwards. So this piece is called The Motherhood Penalty, and I'm just going to kind of go through what I shared on there. So becoming a mother for the first and so far only time in 2017 was an unexpected miracle. I was then a wholly career-driven 33-year-old woman with endometriosis and no real plans to start a family with my then long-term partner. But the discovery of becoming pregnant took several tests taken in the toilets of my workplace and a visit to my GP in order to finally believe that my time to become a mother had actually arrived. Yet, despite the fact that at the time I was only several months into what felt like a dream opportunity to work on special projects for the executive office of a fintech startup, there was zero question in my mind on discovering the news that I was with child, that this baby was indeed my baby. And as the news sunk in and I continued in the role, whilst fighting off nausea to continue travel and working on challenging but really enjoyable project work, the sense of overwhelm due to having made zero preparation in readiness of the news of becoming a mother at that stage in my life was enormous. I was, back then, a high-flying, hard-working, frequently partying, 30-something city living girl after all. Yet, I made the decision, along with my long-term partner of 10 years at that time, that this baby would be welcomed into the world by us full-heartedly. Together, we would figure out how to make our lives and careers work in tandem with raising this small human, who would go on to become our much-beloved daughter. Whilst continuing to embody my characteristically optimistic disposition, I was also somewhat terrified. I knew only too well of the stories of many previously high-flying career women who had trodden the path before me, being knocked back, held back, or both in their careers post-maternal escapades. So much so that regardless of the known challenges I would potentially encounter with my childbearing years, thanks to likely fertility hurdles, I had not yet prioritised having a child into my life plan. On the contrary, my thinking in those early years of my 30s, where my career began to take off, alongside my biological clock that never ceased screaming its ticking at me, went something like this. Perhaps you can start trying for a baby when you've reached director level. Or we can start thinking about starting a family when you're earning this level of salary. And you can maybe think about what it would be like to become a mum when you've been working at this company for maybe X number of years and you've got your foot firmly in the door. Whilst part of these considerations can be reasoned as being responsible family and life planning, in the most part, these thoughts were fueled by the knowledge that I not only enjoyed a lifestyle which was largely funded by my career as opposed to that of my partner, but also, and perhaps more critically, my thinking was propelled by the deep knowing that as soon as I stepped off the career ladder, there was a high probability that my career prospects, earning potential, and long-term life prospects would be derailed by the reality that as a mother, my priorities would shift. The price for this shift, to accommodate the life of a child into my career, my capacity to perform at the highest level, inclusive of early starts, late evenings, out working, outperforming, keeping pace with the demands of the corporate world that I belong to, would be diminished. Be that momentarily through the early years of my child's life, or perhaps forever. In short, I would no longer be able to perform like a childless woman, or more importantly, like a man. Breaking the news to my boss of my pregnancy, who happened to be the CEO of the firm I worked at, was something I put off several times. And I want to make it clear that this has nothing at all to do with the sort of man my boss was. He was and is a great guy who is an avid advocate and supporter of women's careers and advancement. It was, however, the result of a deeply ingrained fear that my position would be at risk on account of my relatively short period of time working for the company, which at that time was approximately 6 months, coupled with the knowledge that the role I worked within had been created for me and would therefore potentially be more disposable. As my pregnancy unfolded, my role morphed to become one that was more office-based. Travel decreased, and in tandem with my bosses, I created policies for maternity leave, paternity leave, and family-friendly support. I'll caveat that by saying that I was in a HR project, special projects capacity. The company also was in its own embryonic stage at that time. It lacked these policies. So despite this, and despite that what was created, it wasn't only fair, but it also sought to lay a really solid foundation of family planning accommodations, which reflected the ethos of the leadership team. Not only was I grateful for these policies, but also the support and care provided to me at the company. In tandem, despite my growing pregnancy, I dedicated myself to continuing my performance. Early starts, late finishes, and too many times than I care to admit, prioritising my work over attending NCT preparation classes I booked onto. My priority, alongside ensuring that I didn't succumb to my cravings — I had really horrendous cravings for fresh egg mayonnaise sandwiches from Pret a Manger, whose freshly made mayonnaise containing raw eggs was therefore forbidden during my pregnancy. But it was to also ensure that my pregnancy did not in any way alter the perception of my committedness to my role at work. Throughout discussions about my upcoming maternity leave with my bosses, the CEO and CFO, who I had dual reporting lines to, I sought to assure them that I would be back in just 12 weeks. My CEO, a man with young children himself, was confident that my views would change as soon as a little life entered my world. His own experiences in becoming a parent informing his position far more than the aspirations I had defined as my own. Still, I protested, and I made plans to take as little time off as possible, seeking out and retaining childcare arrangements as a priority in my pre-motherhood preparations. Yet when the time did eventually arrive for my maternity leave, I was still working, up to and including on my due date no less, working from home in the final weeks before my daughter arrived, thanks to carpal tunnel syndrome, which had contributed towards my pregnancy ailment and resulted in me being swollen like a ginormous balloon, but also struggling to walk. The sign off from office life felt really hard. I had always been a worker bee, always worked hard since school, throughout my continued studies and beyond. As such, the prospect of life without my career identity for a while left me feeling disoriented and really quite lost. My daughter's arrival into the world, despite careful planning for a non-medicalised birth, failed to go to plan. Instead, informed by my midwife team and doctor that I had failed to progress sufficiently, I never experienced contractions in line with my predicted window of birth. As a woman defined as being geriatric in maternal terms due to my age, I had reached the stage of danger thanks to this status and would have no choice but undergo an emergency C-section. the outcome of which determining that any plans I previously aspired to about returning to work following just 12 weeks would be diminished. I wish I could say that the rest of my maternity leave went swimmingly, but sadly it did not. My C-section led to infections, extending the recovery period required to become fully mobile. My partner lost his employment, facing further pressure on the maternity leave savings I had made. My daughter then had an adverse reaction to her immunisations, leading to a truly harrowing stay at Birmingham Children's Hospital for just under 2 weeks. These challenges, coupled with the home my partner, daughter and I had recently moved to prior to her birth, posing a variety of issues with neighbours, but also construction development works, which led to us staying with my parents for a number of weeks in an effort to regain some maternity leave peace of mind and equilibrium. Further to this, changes back at work saw a shift in some members of the leadership team. The planned keep in touch calls that I had scheduled with one of my bosses, the CFO, were seldom kept, and on one particular occasion I'd rushed back home from a baby yoga session with my daughter to make a rescheduled keep in touch call, only for the call to remain unanswered with no response to voicemail or email querying what had happened. My anxiety about the safety of my position at the company, coupled with the general anxiety that I already felt, was mounting. The combination of new motherhood, circumstances outside of my control, hormones and anxiety made for a dangerous cocktail, contributing to a diagnosis of postnatal depression. As someone prone to depressive and anxious episodes since my teenage years, not only would I be more susceptible to postnatal depression, but the need for additional support was unquestionable. The issue with returning to work under the cloud of challenges I had experienced during my maternity leave is that whilst desperately wanting to appear unchanged and capable in my role, which had also expanded to support growing demands of the business, is that I didn't speak up about how hard I was finding it. My little family had also during that time moved out of the city following my daughter's stay at the Children's Hospital and the problems with our apartment, so we were living in closer proximity to family. That meant, however, that what had previously been a short trip to get into the office now involved a commute by train. Nothing too terrible on paper, but as a still breastfeeding mother of just 9 months and therefore still being ravaged by hormones, coupled with anxiety, depression, the stress of a newly appointed CFO to report to, I found myself experiencing panic attacks on the journey into work, whilst at the office, and on one particular occasion out at lunch with my friend and colleague in a really public place, which was tough to manage. Reflecting back on that time, the most rational and sensible thing to have done would have been to have spoken up about what was happening to me. Yet my desire to present a professional, not in any way affected by new motherhood disposition, I did quite the opposite. I hid my panic attacks. I expressed milk in the toilets. I took on more than I could reasonably handle. So desperate was I to keep everything going, particularly as I was now the only earner, with my partner remaining at home to become a stay-at-home dad. The fear post my daughter's stay in hospital had rendered it pretty much impossible for me to consider her being taken care of anyone else that wasn't family, resulted in the unravelling of my ability to soldier on. And the outcome of the unravelling saw me submitting my resignation. I provided 3 months' notice and worked until my last day as an employed person in the autumn of 2018. My plan was to become self-employed, work freelance, and inspired by the many, many other working mothers I both followed and befriended via social media, I could balance my motherhood with continuing my career in a new form. But what I had also planned to do was to return to the workforce when my daughter was older. Ideally, once she had started at school, and if I would have been blessed enough to have had a second child, my hypothetical second would be in nursery, freeing up some of my time to step back into the promising career track that I had left behind. Emboldened by this plan, I also returned to university to get an MBA. My aim was to differentiate myself from those who also chose to step out of the working world for a time to raise young children, demonstrating my commitment to continuous personal development and the career that I'd spent more than 2 decades developing. Yet the position that I find myself in today is far more challenging than I predicted. The time spent working in a self-employed capacity, freelance for a number of organisations since 2018, appears to have gone against me. The MBA that I spent 2 years working to attain and self-funded appears to have made me overqualified, or at least that's the feedback that I've received from a number of the appointments that I was being considered for over the course of the last couple of months. My being a mother who wants to have enough balance to work both outside the home alongside motherhood is also evidently a big issue for many of the employers I've spoken with since the beginning of the year too. All of which does have a bitter tasting irony to it, particularly as the research and the dissertation project that I completed for my MBA was titled Stemming the Bleed, exploring the root cause of why mid-career women are leaving the UK workforce. And the dissertation received a distinction, the research outcomes indicating that a combination of attitudes towards working parents, mothers especially, have not evolved sufficiently to support the balance required for family life and career to coexist harmoniously. And further to this, my own experiences as a now single mother seeking financial security, greater financial security and stability, which can be attained through permanent employment, has really been a torturous series of events. Much promised, nothing delivered. Many discussions about potentially interesting roles that would benefit enormously from my experience, so much so that some of these employers have contacted me, not the other way around. But they failed to convert to offers on account of my need and my desire and my preference to work hybrid or part-time or flexibly. And my view is that the culture of hostility towards working mothers is not only damaging to the workforce and to our economy, but the distinct lack of adoption of technological innovations that support working remotely and flexibly, combined with creativity around how to integrate new ways of working into traditional formats, is really damaging the prospect of women, damaging the prospect of families, and damaging our society at large. I don't believe that it has to be this way. And I really would urge workplace leaders in whatever capacity it is that they are to consider evolving their outdated thinking on the world of work. And they need to do this swiftly and readily and really for the benefit of both the workforce and working families, wherever they might be and whatever stage of family life they are at. And so if you are listening to this and you've got through this podcast and you're just a little like me in a position where you're thinking, what next? You know, trying to find work that fits around my child or my children, trying to find well-paid work that fits around my child or children. If you're trying to negotiate flexible working with your employer, if you're trying to have a degree of support from your managers because maybe your child is sick, or maybe there are times that you aren't able to get to the office on time because there's challenges with getting your children off to school or to their childminder or whatever it is, then there really are so many things out there that need to be fixed. And I want to share that I feel the challenges that you're experiencing as well, like those things are hitting across the board for so very many of us solo parents and single mothers. And in just typical style, I'm going to try and do something to change it and to try and contribute to it getting better. There are many people already that are doing a really fantastic job on that, but I think it really does require very many more voices and many more opinions and points of view being positioned, so that people will start to wake up and they recognise that there's a whole breadth of talent that are being described as economically inactive. And maybe those people wouldn't be economically inactive if companies were prepared to allow people to work more flexibly, to balance the fact that their children need to be looked after as well as earning a living. So if there is anything that I've shared on this episode that has piqued your interest and you think, yeah, I'm in a really similar boat, or, you know, I know somebody that's having a similar feeling, then again, as ever, my contact information is in the show notes, and I'm really encouraging women who are solo parents, single mothers, who are experiencing some of these challenges to contact me and to reach out to me, because I do think there's a great deal of strength to be found in solidarity. And I think the more of us that band together and make some noise to try and drive change will only be beneficial in the long term. But as ever, thank you very much for listening to the Single Era Diaries. I will be back on a more frequent basis going forward, and there's some other podcasts that are going to be launched by Nascent Media over the course of the coming weeks and months, so keep an eye out for that. But as ever, thank you for listening. If you are dating, date safely. If you're trying to get employed, then apply safely. But for now, peace out. The Single Era Diaries is produced and distributed by Nascent Media and executive produced by me, Jade Graham. Podcasts grow by being liked and shared. So if you enjoyed today's show, then please be sure to like and share with a friend who you think will enjoy the show too. Subscribe, and if you have a moment to rate and review wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, that would be super appreciated too. Thank you for listening, and peace out.